Today. This is going to be part two of our webinar series, our three-part webinar series that we're going to be doing today. And I'm excited to announce that we're going to be talking about business continuity and disaster recovery, everybody's favorite topic. So go over the panelists. We have a three-part panelist here today. So myself, John Ash, work at Digital Office Systems. I am the VCIO here. Really, my primary role is to be a technology consultant and a strategist to help businesses align technology with their business goals and then help them achieve business outcomes. I have 10 years of experience in the industry and an associate's in network systems administration. We also have Jacob Bruning and Jim Peterson with us. Jacob, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm the operations manager for our managed services team here. I've got about 3 years experience here at Digital Office Systems, but about 13 to 14 years experience in the industry, both inside the Department of the Army and also just in the public sector, doing everything from IT operations and cybersecurity. Got a plethora of certifications there that follow my name. So enjoy.
Thank you. And Jim, welcome.
Thank you. I'm Jim Peterson with ConnectWise. If you're not familiar with ConnectWise, we're a software company. We provide solutions, both security, backup, and operations for managed service providers. I've been in the industry for 25 plus years, 15 of that focused on security and backup with a lot of regulation and security certifications. So,
Awesome. Well, we're happy to have you guys here today. And we'll go ahead and dive right in. What I think the first thing that we want to identify today to help people understand is what is business critical data, or in essence, what are we trying to protect, right? So that's really where I wanted to have you guys share with us some of your ideas of as far as what information is, what businesses should be considering critical data, and what all we can be backing up.
yeah, well, just kind of kick this conversation off. I think a lot of businesses think about their data as files and folders. And if they think of the critical stuff, maybe they're thinking of employee records, HR, financial information. But holistically, any data that is part of the operation of the company really should be considered business critical data. And this could be data that's located anywhere in email, in files, in workstations, in the cloud. So there's a lot of different aspects of this, and to think about what data would I not want somebody to see or I not want somebody to take or lose. That's going to be your business critical data. And so thinking about how to get your arms around that so you're protecting all of this. We have intellectual property up here, which is a technical term, but really a lot of businesses have IP that they just haven't designated as IP.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're seeing data is scattered a lot all over the place nowadays versus when everything used to be, in your own house, per se. So,
and I think I would take that definition just a little bit further, Jim, because you said just what you don't want other people getting. However, I think that's also what you need to get up and running as a minimum for your business. So, especially as we're talking into this disaster recovery, because a lot of the time you will see, or at least we see businesses, they don't know what their critical data is that they need at a minimum to continue business operations on a day-to-day basis. And so a lot of times we see a lot of archival type data they need for redundancy that are still there, that are getting backed up, which causes big backups, slow recovery times. So being able to identify that critical data, which is to need to be operational, that allows us to be able to recover that quickly and get you back up and running faster.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right, Joy, let's go to the next one here. All right. So, Jim, go ahead and share some of these facts here with us that you were telling us about.
Yeah, we can go ahead and throw all these up, and if we think of data protection, what we're trying to protect from is loss. There's a lot of conversations to be had around protecting it from getting into the hands of bad actors. But really we're saying if it's lost, if it's changed, how do we recover? And, just some of these stats each week, 140,000 hard drives fail. I mean, that's a huge number. And really, it's kind of the smallest one, but the bottom one on the list, 34% of backup jobs fail and 38% of restore jobs fail within their required SLA. So when we think about that required SLA, if you define like how fast you need to recover for your business operations and what you need to recover for your business operations, 38% of the time, those aren't meeting the needs of the companies. So this is a real big topic, and a lot of times it doesn't get the flash appeal as cybersecurity or cyber insurance, those things. But holistically, this is one of the most important pieces. So if we think about all of these stats of how many things can go wrong, obviously this is the doom and gloom slide, right? But all of these things that can go wrong, having an appropriate solution that understands all your data, understands your specific requirements is really critical. And then most importantly, making sure it's working right. So probably jump into the next slide. Yeah, and just to kind of roll back into this, and Jacob hit on this specifically, there's so much data out there. Data is multiplying at a fast rate, meaning we're saving things in multiple locations, and it's growing at a fast rate. And a lot of businesses don't have a real strong grip on where all of this critical business data is located. They're backing up what they know, and they'll tell their business partner or their IT partner what they know, where they know the data is. But there's a big chance SaaS backup is a big one. A lot of our SaaS providers don't back up the systems or applications or data in an event where we could restore that locally or to another platform if we had to. Workstations with a remote workforce being everywhere. That's the key of the slide. Working from anywhere, data is everywhere. And a lot of businesses, a lot of end users will do everything they can to be efficient, even saving documents where they shouldn't on their local desktop or local laptop. And a lot of times that specific environment isn't protected. Jacob, I don't know if you see that very often. If you see,
Absolutely. So
yeah.
That's a big one, Jim. We do these exercises, unfortunately, with clients. A lot of times it only happens when we first onboard them, where they're only looking at where their data for that first time, so we can identify it and what goes on. But that where that data is a constant process, and it can't stop at the leadership. Your users have to know why they can't bring that off the server. Well, your server's being backed up. We're not paying for desktop backups. Well, do you have users? Do you know if your users are following those policies? And if they're needing to work really quickly or take something home, what does their process look like? Are they allowed to just take that home or open up a company document on top of or on their personal systems that aren't being backed up, that doesn't have any security protection? And so those are internal policies that we always recommend for our clients to constantly be looking at and to identify to make sure they're in place. But it's not a one-time forget about it. You have to, as an organization, continue to work it. That is a living, breathing policy that has to be evaluated and then spot checked to make sure your employees are doing those right things.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There are times where we would go to a client and find out they've spun up a new HR system online. And you're like, hey, this is something we should really know about, because if we can protect it, we really should. And just finding a way to follow some core guidelines and making sure wherever that data is, that it's in the best protection state as possible.
Absolutely. I think, guys, that's a great segue into, the next slide here. We talk about, having data everywhere. What is that data? What is it that we're trying to protect? But, what actually puts us at risk? I think the cybersecurity side of it ties perfectly into that. Bad actors are always going to be, one of those threats and risks that you have to be aware of, that everybody's familiar of. But even some of the other ones, Jim, go ahead and share some of the other incidents and stuff like that you guys see and are aware of.
Yeah, I mean, bad actors, that gets all the press because it's interface, it's expensive, it's a pain. Whether you have cyber insurance or not, that bad actor attack that affects your data is in the news and is very visible. But we don't want to forget disaster and accident And we think of how a lot of companies will protect their data. A disaster is a terrible one. Following some of the rules we'll talk about in a few minutes, like 3-2-1, a disaster can wipe out local and your backup, obviously. So how you're protecting it, the process you're going through to make sure that business critical data is extended not just from your local facility, but offsite as well. Accidents happen. If we clump accidents into failures, basic system, problems, general corruption, things are going to happen. So when we think of all the three of these are true risks, and understanding your specific risk. If you're in a financial market or you have some new IP or intellectual property is going out, you're a large company, a bad actor might be one of your primary risks. If you're in a hurricane zone, disaster for this time of year may be one of your great risks. Accident, if you have older equipment, a lot of technology debt, that may be one of your risks. But understanding where you're at in that risk of each of these is just really critical to know what you need to do to protect that data.
And something kind of going along with this, something we don't hear and talk about a lot is you've got to be able to do an inventory, not just of your physical equipment, but your data. So like if this accident happens or this disaster, how do you work with your insurance claims to make that if you don't have those inventory of the data and the hardware and what that costs your company, the downtime, the getting that data back is going to cost you. But also when we're talking about just even accidents, if you're running older hardware, but you're not aware of that. You don't know the risk of, hey, if this switch goes out, what's that going to do to your network? What is your recovery plan and all that? So being able to inventory both your data and your hardware and your software, your vendors is very crucial. It's the first step to being able to identify what is business critical and what that risk is, to identify your risk appetite.
Absolutely.
And couldn't agree more.
Yeah, just to touch on the bad actor one more time, and I know we kind of hit that already, but a lot of small businesses don't think they're a target for bad actors because they're too small. And one thing that we just consistently see, if you have the means and willingness to pay and you have any data you care about, you are a target for bad actors. They're looking for any means to get into any company to affect them to get some sort of ransom. Maybe it's $5,000 for a very, very small instance, but hundreds of $1,000s for larger companies. So just because you're small doesn't mean you're not a target.
And that's a dangerous way to think too, just because if you look at what the hackers are doing, they're not these small little, I'm in my basement doing all this. These are organizations. They have an ROI. They have promotion scales, pay scales as well. And they're out there collecting data. How does a salesman get lead? They go out there and just generate leads. Sometimes they're not quantifying those leads. They're just generating it. So it's the same way with the bad actor. They don't know you're a small business. They do a scan out there on the internet and they see, hey, there's a vulnerability. There's a potential ROI there. They're not looking at who you are or what size you are at those early stages. Whether they choose not to go forward or not, they might put that vulnerability for sale because that's still financially viable for them. And a smaller organization may come up and go, that's worth my time. And so thinking that you're safe because you're small or you're in the Midwest is a dangerous way to think, and it's just going to leave you open to vulnerabilities.
Great. So as we move on here, I just want to take one moment for all the attendees here today. If you do have any questions throughout this, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A down below on your screen. We're going to hold off questions until the end. We got a special section just for that, but just wanted to remind you, if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask those. So yeah, I think going back to what Jacob said, cyber attacks, bad actors getting access to that. This is a really good visual representation of, I think, how long actors are actually staying within a network. So Jim, Jacob, what are your thoughts? What do you guys typically see out there whenever threats do happen?
Yeah, I'll just take the first part, Jacob, then you can run with definitely some good thoughts, I'm sure. If you think of, and this is the average. So what we use is industry knowledge. There's a Verizon Dibber report. There's the FBI's report. Veeam does some good reporting as well to talk through what happens in a breach. And most small businesses are very aware of, I click the link and my computer was encrypted, or I clicked the link and it took me to a bad site. But when these more sophisticated attacks typically take, on average 200 days, and the access is just the first piece of it. So, credentials are still the number one leading cause of bad actor access, the username and password side of things. So once they get in, they start stepping through this process. First, they're going to understand your business. They want to do an investigation. They want to know, do you have an insurance policy that they can find so they know the financial limitations that you're already allowed? They want to know what type of data is out there. They want to know what your competition is. They want to know as much as they can. So they're going to do an investigation. Then they're going to start taking the data. They're going to ship it off site so that they can start working on it, because there's kind of 4 vectors of attack. There's ransom, which everybody is very familiar with, but there's also extortion. There's the pay side of it, where they sell your data, and then there's the reputational damage that they try to attack. So they're going to take that data off so that they can do something with it, use it against you. Next step, they manipulate your backup solution. And the big goal there is, if they change production and you can restore it, you've thwarted the attack, or at least a big part of the attack. But if they've changed your data and you cannot restore it, you're in really deep trouble. You have to do something to get that recovered. The last 2 steps, they change the primary data and then they ask for money. So we walk through this process, and this is the typical large scale breach. Jacob, maybe you can talk about kind of more of the small business style.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the biggest ones we deal with quite a bit actually is just the email breach. Something that's very simple, as small as email. A lot of clients don't realize how much data is actually floating in their emails until they actually get that breach, and they have to, do we make that claim or not through insurance? And they start realizing the kind of data that's flowing through there. We don't necessarily see it that 200 days, especially in an email breach. It's down to about 2 weeks. But those steps are the exact same thing. They get in whatever method they use to get that password. We're even seeing now multi-factor authentication, MFA. That was the sure deal to get that done. But if you're receiving your MFA over a text message, that's become notoriously weak now. And even through your multi-factor authentication through an app is starting to get attacked as well, and is becoming weak. And so we're seeing it more and more now. Once they get in, they're doing the same thing. They're doing their investigation. They're doing keyword searches. They're looking for social security numbers, banking account information, invoices. They may not always have a end state of what this attack looks like when they first start. Is this just I'm going to spray out tons of emails from this account so it's trusted, and I might get passwords from other people that I can go out and sell? Or did I just hit the financial person of this organization? Now I've got a good target, so I'm not going to change my attack vector. So they're doing those initial investigations. They're also checking constantly. And then that 2-week period, we see that. And a lot of times we see the rules start being built. So when their attack launches and people start replying, is this real? Is this not? We're seeing those emails not make it to your inbox. They're being automatically marked as read and moved to the big popular ones, the RSS feed folder, or the RSS feed folder, because no one checks in there. So that way you don't even know something's happening. And when you're replying, sometimes they then build out impersonations. We see a lot of times where, especially the big financial hit ones, we've seen even in small Midwest Kansas here in Wichita, we see where this costs $800,000 because they lost it, because the attack saw they had a big C-level employee, it was a CFO. They built a new email domain and they built out an email server. They launched their attack pretending to be a whole bunch of people from the company. They got one of their clients to fall for it and send them the email or send the mail. And next thing you know, the payment of $800,000 is gone. They're following these exact same steps that we're seeing here, just on a shorter timeline. And so a lot of this question is that 200 is obviously the worst case scenario, because that is the whole attack. The goal is not to have to rely on those backups, not how to do it. And so there's new technologies out there. We, for example, are looking into SIM technology. We'll be rolling out. And what that allows us to do is we get more logs. So when we see those weird logins that are not from your organization or from your country, we're able to identify that. Our security operations center, our SOC, is able to act faster, and we're able to jump ahead of that. So that's where a lot of from a security mindset, we're always looking at piling on and layering our defenses. So the goal is not to have to use this backup and recovery. It's to try to stop it and try to get rid of that 200 days and get them out of the network before anything happens. But that's the nice thing about this is you see those 3 yellow steps there. That gives us time with the appropriate tool sets in play to identify before something does happen. And so you've got that short window to identify what's going on before the attack actually starts happening and it's too late.
Well said. Well said. So that is a lot of information. I'm sure a lot of people are thinking in their heads right now, okay, well, I think the first thing I probably need to do is what, or try to figure out what data I have maybe. So go ahead and hit the next slide here. So what are some common things that you can do to really figure out exactly where to start tackling this? I think that's really kind of the best way to look at it, right? Because it's an elephant. You got to take one bite at a time. So we broke it down into 3 categories here that I think really help, highlight on what Jacob said, what Jim is saying. And what I'll say too is the first part is the assessments, right? So we'll look at assessments, we'll look at the MDR, like Jacob said, and then the backup side of it. Go ahead to the next slide here. So the first thing you can look at that I would recommend is taking the time to do a business impact analysis. This is something that digital office systems can help you do. I made it easy for you. There's a little QR code you can scan real quick while we have this slide up, and you can schedule a time with me and we can set up a little 30-minute meeting and do a scan, or sorry, not a scan, but an assessment just to see where you're at. And some of the things that we'll go through. Jim, tell me a bit about what you guys see in as far as the experts in the industry as for what a business impact analysis scan should look like. What all are the things we need to be collecting during that time?
Yeah, the most important part of a business impact analysis, it really is the result, right? I mean, that's not surprising of any assessment, but what we're trying to get our arms around are the functions that your business need to operate, the continuity side. What are the things that have to be in place and how important are they, or like what is the criticality of that business function? Communication is always a key one. So email, phones, depending on the dependency you have on those two, we may need to increase the criticality and decrease the maximum tolerable downtime. Or we can lower them if those aren't critical as your sales site or your purchasing process. But it's identifying those processes in the business that leverage technology so that we can ensure a recovery process for them. So if we know the function, we know the processes, we know the dependencies, we can assign that criticality, the downtime maximum amount, and then build a response plan to say, if we were to have an incident, here is the process we would go to restore so that we can get the most important things running first.
Yeah, I agree. You got to know what you have in order to be able to protect it.
Yeah.
So outside of an assessment, what are the things that we would look at doing to that next step, right? So you've done an assessment, you identified things. The next step is going to be able to protect those things, right? So if we go to the next slide here, this is one of the pieces of the protection side of things that we really value the most. And most of our customers also see most of the biggest value in this solution as well, which is called managed detection and response. Jake, I'm gonna let you talk a little bit about the managed detection and response, how that's different from EDR or endpoint detection and response, and a lot of the benefits of that.
Yeah, you guys can read right there, but let's go on to the next slide, which will kind of break down the differences here. But so this is the fun part for me. This is where we are actively working and being proactive. This is to get everybody out of the network. This is to identify as they come in and prevent it going any further. And so traditional, this is a nice layered approach here. So traditional endpoint security is your AV, your antivirus. It does have limitations. That is, antivirus works off of a set of definitions. So if the threat is known, the ransomware type, the malware type, if it's a known deal that's out there in the production environment, out there in businesses, antivirus can get it. But what that lacks is, what about those threats that we call 0 days? They have not been seen yet, or they have been seen, but there is no patch, there is no fix for it. And that's where your traditional antivirus really kind of falls off. So that's when we move into our EDR solution, that it's EDR goes beyond antivirus, because it's not working on just the known. It still pulls those definitions and helps work with that, because I mean, we face it, there's so many new threats always coming out. Every antivirus is working to keep that database up, but they update them in different increments. So that's why having both of those working together on two different lists, that nice layer of protection. But EDR goes that next step. They utilize artificial intelligence and machine learning to help find those 0 days. When they see that attack happen, that file that got accidentally clicked, that link that was clicked and downloaded something, it's looking at what that file is trying to do on your system, and then it will stop and quarantine that and go, hey, this is weird for this system, that's weird for this user, and this file should not be going here. So we stop that, we get eyes on from then. Stopping that's great, it prevents it, but we still need eyes on that. We still need that human touch of being able to look at it. And that's where the MDR comes in. So you've stopped it and you quarantine it, but if it's a legitimate file, or if it is a bad file, what are you doing? You can't just leave it on your computer. So that's where that the MDR is just the EDR, endpoint defense. It's your managed version of it. So now it's being monitored by a SOC, a security operations center, 24/7, 365. Whenever that alert goes, it stops something weird from happening. You get eyes on from an actual cyber trained person to take a look at that and evaluate if this is a risk or not, and getting it off that machine, instead of letting a risk just be quarantined and sitting there. Well, let's get that completely removed. Let's work with the client to figure out what's going on, if this is legitimate or not. And so those are the different stages as we work with that endpoint protection, and to help get in front of and keep the bad actors out, or the malware out before it even gets to your systems.
Oh yeah. Perfect. And just one more thing on that, Jacob, that I've also seen.
Mhm.
Typically antivirus only looks at the files, right? Versus
Mm.
an EDR system with advanced attacks today, they'll hide within memory, they'll be hidden within services, within macros and different documents. So it may not necessarily be seen by a typical file-based scanner,
Mhm.
which is
And
also a
this
big benefit of it.
And this is also important to your backup recovery plan, because if you can't identify this stuff in time quick enough, which that human error, we can't move as fast as technology can. And so that's what's important, is because hackers know, the bad actors know, that a recovery just by doing a backup is a way to get around their payments. And so if they can place their stuff and be on your computer long enough that your backups grab it and back it up, and stay quiet long enough, so after a while, I mean, people can't retain backups for a year or 2 years. Typical backups are being retained for about 3 months, just because of the cost of storage and the resource requirements that are needed there. If they can just stay long enough, then you have no good backup. Or even if you have a good backup, but that good backup that doesn't have the malware in it is 3 months old, what's that impact your organization? Can I recover and then rebuild 3 months of data? And so that's a lot of their goal too, is just to get backed up in there. And so it's so important to have a good endpoint protection system in play to help prevent it from getting that far.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's important to note, just the typical AV is not going to keep up with it
Yeah.
anymore. That's why it's very important to have it. And so that leads us to our next slide, which is what is BCDR, right? People have heard of backups. They've heard of, I think some probably heard of backup and disaster recovery, but gosh, there's so many acronyms here today. What exactly is BCDR, Jim?
Yeah, so I would just really focus on two of the letters, continuity and recovery. So continuity, right, keeping the business running or returning the business to a functional state as fast as possible, and recovering, so returning the data, returning the systems, returning the functions. So there's a nice example up here of a long term, but when we think of BCDR, it's really three phases. It's the technology. So that's what we would call backup, right? It's the processes we follow, your disaster recovery plan, your incident response plan, your business continuity plan, and it's the people that actually execute those tests and test those tasks to make sure that it's actually going to work when we need it the most. So We can probably pop into the next one here. So why do you care, right? Why did you jump on a webinar? And at the end of the day, for a long time, people have used the term BCDR or BDR, all these acronyms to describe backup. And if we think of backup as itself, it's just not enough. It doesn't tell a whole story for the restoration or the continuity side of a business. Just like Jake was saying, if you're backing up 30 days or 60 days, but your industry requirement is multiple years, your backup could really be lacking and you could be at risk. In addition, backup itself doesn't solve the problem of data growth or data manipulation or multiplication. So we needed that process and people to solve those kind of problems. We have last line of defense, financial impact, data is everywhere. BCDR is that holistic solution to make sure that your data is protected, all of your business critical data is protected and can be restored in the timeline that you need. So you can jump ahead.
Perfect.
Yeah, so this go ahead,
No,
John.
I was just going to say real quick, we've talked a lot about the multi-layered approach when it comes to cybersecurity. Is backup part of cybersecurity? I most certainly think it is. It's an extremely important component of it as well. So as we look at this here, I'm gonna let you guys take over, but this is typically what I think is a good cybersecurity solution stack for most small and medium businesses today.
Yeah, all of these solutions are great. And we'll also start with almost no company goes from 0 to 100 in one decision or one order. It's kind of a journey and a process. A lot of companies start with MDR and DNS filtering, move to security awareness training, and then they have to really understand the access management, SIEM and SOC, and how those play. Jacob talked quite a bit about SIEM and SOC and how that helps kind of shorten that risk timeline. But at the end of the day, nothing's 100%. Nothing's 100% protective. And while we hate that B word, it's not something we like to talk about. If we were to have something bypass the stack we have, that's where it's like the insurance policy. We don't want to use it. We never want to have to use it, but we want to know that it's going to work when we need it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll go to the next one here. What are some of the top challenges that we see with BCDR? Why are people a little hesitant on it at times?
Well, if you think like back early in one of the slides, we talked like 38%, 34% of jobs fail, 38% of restores fail, or backup and restores. And a lot of that just falls around configuration. Backup system by itself doesn't grow, doesn't scale. It just works. And it's a lot of false positives that can happen. It doesn't test itself to the point that we want it to test itself. So configuration is just a real challenge in this because data is growing at such a fast rate and is expanding into so many areas that it needs to be constantly monitored and maintained to ensure that you're actually protected. There's baseline configurations, like it's just configured incorrectly. And then there's also that scope and scale and process challenge, where I just don't have a process in place for data expansion. I don't have a process in place for talking about new systems that come online. And then as that scope and scale changes, I'm not catching new data as it's being created. These are just things we see consistently with kind of a less mature version of a backup system.
Absolutely. And that's a lot of people don't realize how big data grows. They think, well, my data is growing because I'm adding more files, I'm adding more growth to my company. But that's not always just the case. Just the advancement of technology. I mean, if we look back in the day of the floppy, we could put tons of files on a floppy disk. Same way with thumb drives. But now that same file today, just because of all the back-end compatibility and everything, is substantially larger, and you can only put maybe one on that same storage. So even though your data may not be growing in number, it is growing in size just due to technology updates, just to provide more security, to provide more audit capabilities on the back end. Our data files are just getting bigger. And so not only have to worry about that constant growth, but you also need to look at like what we did when we're talking about inventorying your data. What is important? If I have my 3 years of historical data that I have to have, sitting on the same storage device as my production and live data that I'm currently working on. Well, if your backup solution can't break that down and something happens, I now have to recover that into all your archive data too at the same time as your production data before you can get up and working. You may not care about getting that archive data back immediately to work. You care about it still, you want it, but it doesn't need to be in those first few hours for you to operate. But if you're storing everything in the same place, your recovery time is going to be slower and longer because you don't have those internal processes like Jim was talking about. Those internal processes of where this data actually needs to go and why I'm keeping it and what is critical to to return to normal operations.
Absolutely. All right. Next, I want to talk on the 3-2-1 rule. Jory, go ahead and go to the next slide here. This is something that I've preached. Jacobs, I know you've preached. We preach it to our customers. So tell us about the 3-2-1 rule. What is it?
Yeah, so I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Everybody's probably heard this a lot. Three copies of your data in 2 different medias, 1 offsite, plus proper configuration. The 3-2-1 was a long time. We're adding the plus because a lot of times we see even with 3-2-1, you can be at risk. So we're saying 3 copies of your data, right? You have your production image that you're working on, your production files you're working on, you have your local backup for fast restore, and you have your remote offsite backup for disaster. And having those set up so that we're constantly protecting that data and can restore it quickly is the critical piece of this and why it's so important. If we go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say we're seeing a great technology as helping with this 3-2-1 plus because before we just do the backups and like you show those percentages of those backups failing. A lot of times it's configured correctly. It's even the software shows that the backup happened. But then when you go to restore that, you see nothing there. You just see a shell of a file. But everything was green lighted through there. Everything was done properly. It could be just, your internet speeds had some issues or whatever the case is. And so we're seeing a good chunk there when we're really worried about that. We can now validate a lot of those backups where we actually spin it up in real time after the backup, bring it online, test it to make sure it's actually there, it will work. And getting that little extra peace of mind knowing that.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So the next slide here talks about some of those common challenges that we see. Jim, I think I like this visual. Tell me a little bit about this.
Yeah, so if we look at the 3-2-1 in general, we say production local, and let's just freeze there for a second if we can. Production local and offsite. We're following the 3-2-1 rule. We even have geographic distance between our local and offsite backup. But what we can find is as data is growing, maybe it's not getting replicated through. So that's the option of the 2 below, the cloud data and the workstation data. Well, getting that in the 3-2-1 system is also critical because just having 1 copy of it, again, we're just at risk. And it's not necessarily just the accident or disaster risk. It's that bad actor risk. That's probably a little bit more real. The potential is more real for encryption or challenges if we don't do a couple little things. So if a breach were to come in and affect our production, we want to make sure it can't touch our local backup and it can't touch our offsite backup. If we go ahead and step this forward, we'll use immutable storage. And all that really means is a big word. All that means is it is isolated. It is protected. It's not using the same authentication mechanism. It's not on the same network. It is, if we can attack the production network, it's not going to affect the offsite backup. So we can go ahead and step 1 more, making sure both our local and our offsite backup have data protection so that if one is affected, it's not going to take that step 6 of BCDR manipulation. We can avoid that step, and then we can really protect both our ability to restore quickly and avoid those expensive ransom payments. The last real piece of this is just knowing that if we're going to go off-site, a lot of times we'll pick really inexpensive storage thinking it's just for a disaster. And that's a real thing because it can be expensive. But what we want to think of is the performance to restore that offsite backup to production data if we ever had to. Using Glacier or really slow storage, it can take a long time to restore terabytes and terabytes of data. So it's just something to consider when you're building your complete backup or BCDR solution, is that performance aspect as well.
All right. do you want to be back up in, a day or two, or do you want to be back up, in a week or two?
Yeah,
That's a big serious difference. And I think as a business, part of that business impact analysis is you have to identify what is the cost, of this if something were to happen. If I were to lose this data for X amount of time, how much is that going to cost me? I've talked to customers, I talked to a lot of different people. I've talked to businesses that lose tens of thousands of dollars, an hour or a minute, um, whenever something goes down. So, that's how important it is to implement the right type of a solution to help protect your data. Let's go to the next slide here. So how do you know if your data is protected? I think Jim talk about the readiness IQ. I like this terminology here.
yeah, it's kind of a fun term that we've been throwing around for a little while, and it's just where is a business at with the understanding of their data and their business critical functions? So do they know where all the data is? And it's hard to say 100% yes without really doing an investigation. But if we know where 100% of our data lives, that's one checkbox. How fast do we really need to recover? Because everybody's going to say fast, but the difference between a 1 hour recovery and a 4 hour recovery can be a large amount of money,
Sure.
to consider. So we want to really understand, what does the business really need? Can we be up in 4 hours, 8 hours? The business impact analysis will tell us that by that maximum downtime. Like, what's our maximum downtime? If it's $10,000 an hour, we know we can start doing an ROI on our RTO, our recovery time objective, to know what we really need to have for recovery. And then it's the rear view mirror. What do we need to preserve? And that doesn't just mean what data do I need to make sure I back up, how long do I need to back it up? Just like Jacob was saying, it was sorting that to understand what data do I need to recover and when. It's not just the holistic picture from the rear view mirror, but understanding these three things will really improve that readiness IQ, that if you know these, you can build the right BCDR solution. If you build the right BCDR solution, you'll be ready for an incident if it were to happen.
Perfect.
And I see working with clients all the time is when you're going through these three questions, run through some scenarios. Because a lot of times, like you said, it's hard to find where 100% of our data lives. But if you're not sitting down and breaking down, going to every department and go, all right, what are you doing? You'd be surprised, actually, some of the processes I've developed that a C level may not have realized was going on, even in their own departments. And so this can't just be a owner or a CEO or even your crew doing this. This has to be your entire leadership team coming together to run these assessments to truly identify this. Because we hear all the time too, is like, oh, if this went offline, I'll be okay for a couple of days. Well, but then when we turn around and challenge them, okay, turn your server off, turn your computers off for one day. Let's unplug you from the internet. Well, let's not do that. It's more important than you realize a lot of the time until you actually see what your processes are doing and actually audit your internal self honestly, and looking at those processes through your leadership teams, and even talking to your individual Joes and Janes down there doing the work of like, hey, what is the impact if I do this to you? They might tell you some stuff that you didn't quite realize as these jobs just grow over time. And so to be able to actually do that full inventory and go through this, and don't just treat this as a real quick 3 questions I asked myself, treat this as an act, take it to your next staff meeting with your leadership team and run through these 3 questions and run through a disaster of, hey, we had an ice storm coming up in this winter. It took out internet for 2 days. How are we going to get around this?
Oh yeah. All right, next slide, please. So I think probably one of the most important parts of that both of you highlighted on is knowing where your data is at. I think that's very important because there's probably data out there that people have that don't even realize that they have or didn't think about, or it was used by somebody at some point in time, but no longer is employed there. So, it's still there, but nobody knows how to get access to it. And how critical is that data? We don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So Jacob, tell me a little bit, or go on a little bit here about where your data lives, and what are some of the places that you see people finding it that unexpectedly?
Yeah, absolutely. So The biggest one is like when you, especially if you got turnover, businesses grow, turnover always costs, but that knowledge loss, we see multiple times where people create shortcuts on their desktop for this data, but they don't actually know where that data is going until a server migration happens. And then when we're working through the client and they go, wait, where's this at? I had this P drive all the time. Well, that actually wasn't the drive. That was just a shortcut you had to someplace else. And so they think they know where the data is without actually following that data trail back. We see all the time too, especially email. They don't realize how many attachments are being put in there and being on. And they also don't know what their users are doing. We've seen multiple times where users like, yeah, I'm going to work on this at home, and they drop it in a personal G drive. The company no longer has access to that data. They can't even see it. They cannot protect it. And so, but the employee is unaware of that. And so that's where a lot of that policy and ensuring your users, I mean, security cannot be done at a leadership level. It has to be done through the entire company. Everybody is a security officer in a company. And until you have that mindset, you're going to have people doing what is the easiest for them. And so the biggest ones we see is email and personal Dropboxes or cloud storage, OneDrive, Google Drive, Dropboxes. They just don't realize they're moving that data because the employee's just trying to work. They're trying to do right by the company. They're trying to do right by their bosses and just get this done and working. And so you just need to make sure you understand. That's why you have to bring everybody in, and when you're doing your assessments and identify where it's all at. You'll be surprised where you'll find data.
Oh yeah. I think it's important to note too, you mentioned the OneDrive, the Dropbox, the cloud storages of the world. I hear all the time from people whenever I'm talking to them about different types of backups and how are they backing up data. And I was like, what about Office 365? Do you back that up? And the first question I get is, or the first response that I get is, well, that's why I put it in OneDrive because it's backed up, right? I tell them no, but Jim, share a little bit about your experience with that. Being 25 years in the industry.
I mean, the biggest piece of specifically the M365 is it's not backup that aligns with most business needs. They may have a data protection policy in place. You may have some data that you can recover, but it's not going to follow the standards that you need to have for a business. The timelines, the aging don't match most business required RPOs. So the only way to be sure that you can restore that data is to go grab it, pull it off, and make sure you have a copy of it. And Microsoft says the same thing.
Yeah. And we always recommend implementing a SaaS or software as a service backup into your Office 365 environment as well. So it's a little different than a full BCDR when you have data, sitting locally on files and folders or servers or systems that you're trying to protect, right? Because it's all in the cloud. But again, it doesn't mean just because it's in the cloud doesn't mean that it's backed up and always fully protected.
And one of those things we talk about the risks, the accidents, the bad actors, but one thing we don't think about what could be a bad actor is your internal people, whether it be an accidental delete or remove something. We've seen that multiple times, even in OneDrive and stuff like that. They moved a folder, but they didn't realize they accidentally moved that until like a month or two later when they're looking for that data. Well, they thought it was deleted and they couldn't find it. And so if you rely on Microsoft's traditional 30-day backup, that's too late. I mean, if you did accidentally delete it, it's gone. And so you need that additional. But what about people moving out of your organization? We have seen that multiple times where the management team suspects that this was not a good termination. It was not left in good terms, and there was deleting of emails there and key emails working with current clients on project and things. They started that deleting beyond 30 days. We're actually able to recover that for them because they had our SaaS backup for up to a year. So, you don't know what they're all deleting. I mean, they're going through these processes, employees mad at for whatever the reason may be, and they start deleting your data. And then they sit there quiet and nobody notices it gone for months. And that's where you just got to have additional layers.
Absolutely. So we'll go ahead and move on here. Just a quick little wrap up. The next part we'll ask Q&A. So if you guys have any questions and haven't submitted those yet, please go ahead and do so now. But yeah, critical data, I think that's probably one of the top things you got to identify. What is your business's critical data? What is it that you need to protect? Where is that data located? What happens if something does happen, and how quickly do you need to be back up? Identifying those systems that need to be up with priority, right? You need your email up so you can communicate. That's typically one of the number one systems that we, hear about that needs to be up and running. So, and then again, you got to protect yourself from the common threats that are out there. Like Jacob was saying, utilize an MDR solution, utilize something that will help provide you that additional level of protection that you need. And then again, you got to put all of this together, right? And it's not just one solution you're going to get. It's all the solutions that you need to help protect your environment, your network, your data, your business. All that's encompassed within BCDR. So going to the next slide, we'll go ahead and dive into some questions here. I have one question. How long does a BIA take, the business impact analysis? Jim, how long do you guys usually take? I know we were talking about this, but there's, different levels of business impact analysis. How deep do you want to go?
Right. No, that's a great question. So there's a couple different ways to attack this, and typically we do a light version of this, somewhere around an hour conversation, go back, write a report, and give the high level facts. From there, we can determine how deep we really need to go. Do we need to build out every function because we just don't know? Do we need to understand a lot more about the business so that we can do a proper BIA? So the light version, kind of a quick check to make sure that, hey, I know where my data is at. I know my recovery time. I know my recovery history that I need. That's about an hour conversation. Getting into the full build out of every function, process, dependency, it's going to take a little longer, a couple hours.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, if you scan this QR code, we'll set up like a quick 30-minute to an hour session just to kind of start that conversation with you, and help you identify some of the basic pieces that you should be looking at through just a quick conversation. And then if we need to do a deeper dive from there, we'll take that next step. But we're happy to offer just a quick business impact analysis. If you would like to, feel free to scan this and submit it onto my calendar, and we'll get something set up. I got another question here. Jacob, this one's for you. How do I know if I have AV or EDR or MDR?
So that's a pretty good common question there, because antiviruses for most systems are going to come pretty baked in. Microsoft's got their Defender, and so for the most part, I mean, the operating systems of the world, they're realizing security is no longer one of those we just put it optional, we'll turn it on or not. So most systems should come with a baseline deal. Now, again, the baseline is a risk just because they're going off the one size fits all. They're not trying to tailor it to anything. And so it's going to still lean towards more of the operational capability versus the security side of it. So because security and operations, they just kind of conflict with each other. The more secure you get, the less operational friendly that's going to be. And so you're gonna know for the MDR and EDR, especially if you're a C-level. If you don't know that, you need to be getting with your IT teams and stuff like that, because that's not going to be something that just comes bake in. That's not going to be something you're just going to have and got without knowing about it. There's going to be there's a service behind that, so there's going to be a trail of who your provider is and what they're doing. And if you don't have anyone monitoring that, that's when, again, kind of doing these assessments are going to work, because we working with John and our other VCIO, they'll be able to identify what you have, what those setups look like, because especially if you have the EDR, the endpoint detection, without the monitoring, without someone doing it, and if you don't know if you have that or not, that's already kind of, I would say, looking at those three questions of your readiness IQ of you need the assessment done. Because if you don't know at this point, then you really need to do the assessment and figure it out.
Perfect. Got another question here. I think this will be good for both of you. Where should offsite backups be located?
Yeah.
Can they be in my basement?
Yeah, Jacob, why don't you start that one?
Yeah, we always just do the cloud just because we have good vendors for pricing and things like that. But honestly, I mean, back in the old days, it was, you had IT guys doing their backups, grabbing that hard drive and taking it to their house with them. Every business is going to be a little different. I mean, if you're a business that actually is separated by geographical location and you have another business in another state or another branch office in another state, that actually may be a good backup solution for you, backing up over to that internet and to that site. But if you're in Wichita and you have a backup in another branch office in Wichita, is it enough? That comes down to your risk appetite. I would say no, just because we are in the tornado alley here, and we've seen the damage spread of it. And you're now just hoping that you don't lose both branches to that. Because if you lose both branches to something, and we pray that nothing ever like this happens, just because being in a city, the loss toll there's is great. But that's the level of risk analysis that you have to be willing to do. Is it's not just how far is my basement safe? Well, what happens if that floods? What happens if your other business floods and then you got a fire in the other? Like, what are the likelihood of that? Pretty low, but it's still one of those. At least if the way we do it, we use Microsoft's cloud system, so we know that data center, it's got generators. So if all of Wichita loses power, where your backups at. Like, we know our backups are good because there's generators going. It may not be backing yourself up because you're without power, but those backups are still safe and they're not being corrupted. We know if those data centers go down, we know our Microsoft data centers are pushing that data over to another data center. So we still have access to those as they're going through. So that's why we rely very heavily on Microsoft clouds, just because they've built that high availability and redundancy for us. So it's an easy check the block of, we know it's safe, we know it's secure.
Yeah, and great answer. I layer a couple things. The old days, we would have said 90 miles. Roughly 90 miles is kind of the gap to get out of a lot of the disaster risks. But that's not the best answer anymore. If we look at a lot of the cloud service providers, they'll let you do East Coast, West Coast. They'll let you select the region so that you can be out of your own region. The biggest part of this is, yes, we want geographic distance, and if we pick 90 miles, great. If we picked 500 miles, even better. But to make sure that network is going to be protected, air gapped, immutable, that's a really important piece, and that we can get the performance and the throughput out of that remote storage when we need it the most. So distance is hugely important for disaster specifically. That immutable storage and performance is hugely important for continuity and for protection from bad actors.
And just a quick story, just kind of an example from an experience I had when we were doing one for an organization back over in Tennessee. We actually had to worry about a fault line, and we were on a fault line. So I was like, well, this organization's up north, but they resided on that same fault line. It's an inactive fault line, but the risk assessment was done on it. And, if something happened along that fault line, our disaster recovery backup, we were running a hot site so we could get up and running again with all the equipment. It was not a viable option, and the risk appetite for the organization wasn't there. And so we had to find someplace off the fault line.
Sounds like a lot of fun. I got one last question here before we'll end the webinar. So how do I know if all of my business data is protected? How do you truly know? I think that's a good question. Jim, how do you truly know?
It's hard to know without, just like Jacob and John were both saying, without a team approach to understanding where your data is living. It's hard to know for sure. Thinking of it holistically, not just looking at one piece of storage or one piece of a business function. And knowing today doesn't mean you'll know tomorrow. So using the team approach, leveraging your vendors to help identify where data is located, and then repeating that process consistently through for the inevitable future to make sure that we don't miss something. Just like we were talking about backups, just because we're backing it up today doesn't mean something doesn't get added that we miss tomorrow. So knowing all our data, it's a team approach. It takes vendors, it takes your staff to understand where they're saving things, and most importantly, where they should be saving things.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think, the important thing is too, with the true BCDR solution, you should also be testing those backups, just to verify, because it's one thing to say it's getting backed up to get that green check mark, the digest every day that says my system's being backed up. But, those metrics we were looking at earlier, how many percentage of backups fail, when it looks like they're healthy. That's a real scenario. So how do you combat that? You test backups. And on a true BCDR solution like ours, we're not only just testing those backups, we're booting up those images to test systems just to make sure they boot up correctly. And then we send that information on to our customers. So that gives you what I call the warm and fuzzies, right? You know that your data is backed up. If something were to happen, you can spin up a virtual instance of that server immediately. The other big benefit of having a BCDR solution is if a tornado does come through, wipes out your entire office, which tornadoes are very prevalent here in Kansas, right? So if that happens, can you spin that servers up in the cloud, right? And then set up a connection between your office well, I guess you wouldn't have an office at that time, but from somewhere, right?
Even
And
sending
then,
your people home at that
yeah,
point
even
to
sending
work.
people home, right? Would you still be
Mhm.
able to have that functionality to run from the cloud, right? So again, when you really dig into it, taking everything back into that holistic view, getting your uh, analysis of your business, where that data is residing, how are you going to protect it, how quickly do you need to be back up and running? Those are all things, I hope hopefully from watching this webinar you learned a little bit, and understanding that maybe this is something that you need to put a little bit more priority on, or something that it would be worth a discussion further. So um, if you have any questions, my email's here. Again, my name is John Ash. Email me jash@dosks.com. Feel free to reach out to me. Jim, Jacob, I really appreciate you taking time to meet with us today and share a little bit about the BCDR. I appreciate
Absolutely. It
it.
was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. We really appreciate it. We will have this meeting recorded on our website, so please go and visit it. We hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you later.